71 years old, and Margaret Whitmore was still delivering cheeseburgers in the dark while her grown children slept under her roof like royalty. The November wind bit through her thin blue DoorDash jacket as she climbed the porch steps of a split-level house on the far side of town, balancing 2 paper bags of takeout in one hand and rubbing warmth back into the fingers of the other. Her knees ached in the cold. The arthritis in her right wrist had been flaring for weeks. But pain had become background noise in Margaret's life, as ordinary as the hum of her aging sedan or the vibration of her phone announcing another delivery request. At 5:42 that morning, while most of the neighborhood still slept beneath warm blankets, Margaret was driving through the dark streets of Columbus, Ohio, delivering breakfast sandwiches to strangers, so she could keep the lights on in a house she no longer felt belonged to her. By the time she pulled into her own driveway a little after 6, the sky had just begun to pale at the edges. Her headlights swept across the overflowing trash bins Jason had promised to take out 3 days earlier. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, both hands gripping the wheel, gathering strength before forcing her stiff body to move again. Inside the house, the smell hit her first: grease, stale beer, and whatever artificial berry scent Brittany's candles released into the air. The living room looked as though a fraternity had passed through it. Fast food wrappers littered the coffee table. A half-empty soda sat sweating onto one of Margaret's coasters.
Her beige blanket,
the one her late husband Harold had bought her for Christmas 8 years earlier, was crumpled beneath Jason's sock-covered feet as he snored on the sectional. Brittany lay beside him, mouth slightly open, wrapped in the expensive faux fur blanket she had bought online for self-care, after claiming she couldn't afford groceries that week. The television still glowed silently, some reality show frozen on the menu screen. Margaret stood there with her purse still over her shoulder, staring at the 2 healthy adults sleeping peacefully in the home she paid for with swollen joints and 12-hour workdays. Jason was 38. Brittany was 35. Both unemployed. Both exhausted, they claimed, from the stress of figuring things out. Margaret quietly bent down and picked up 3 empty takeout containers from the floor. Her spine protested immediately. She moved through the room in silence, cleaning around them the way she had for months now, because if she didn't do it, no one would. She had almost reached the kitchen when Brittany stirred, cracked one eye open, and groaned. "Did you bring coffee?" she mumbled. Margaret turned. "No, dear. I just got home." Brittany frowned like a disappointed customer. "Ugh. You know I can't function without coffee in the morning." Jason didn't even wake up. Margaret stood there for half a second, too tired to answer, then continued into the kitchen where the sink overflowed with dishes neither of them had bothered to rinse. She set down her purse and began rolling up her sleeves. Through the doorway, Brittany's voice drifted in low and amused, thinking Margaret was out of earshot. "Honestly," she muttered with a lazy laugh, "old people are useful when they don't know how to say no." Jason chuckled softly from the couch. Not a shocked laugh. Not an uncomfortable one. A knowing one. The kind shared between people who believed they had already won. Margaret stood frozen at the sink, one hand resting on the counter, the other still gripping the dish towel. Her reflection stared back at her faintly in the dark kitchen window, silver hair escaping her bun, shoulders slightly bent, eyes ringed with exhaustion. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she looked down at her swollen knuckles, red from cold and work and age, and something inside her shifted so quietly neither of them heard it happen. Margaret did not confront them that morning. She did not slam cabinet doors or throw accusations across the room or demand gratitude from people who had long since stopped offering it. Instead, she washed the dishes in silence while the house slowly woke around her, because silence had become her oldest habit. It had started 3 years earlier, after Harold died in the hospital with her hand in his and rain tapping softly against the window. 46 years of marriage had ended in one quiet afternoon, and the house had never sounded the same afterward. For the first month, Margaret moved through her grief like a woman underwater, hearing everything through a haze. Jason had shown up then with flowers, tears in his eyes, Brittany at his side, and he had wrapped his arms around his mother in a way he had not done since childhood. "You should not be alone right now," he had told her gently. "Let us stay for a little while, just until things settle down." Margaret had cried in relief that day. She had thought grief had brought her family closer. First, they had acted like guests. Brittany cooked twice that first week and called Margaret sweet names in a voice warm enough to melt suspicion. Jason mowed the lawn and fixed the loose cabinet hinge Harold had never gotten around to repairing. They sat with her in the evenings and watched old sitcom reruns, and Margaret had believed perhaps the worst thing in her life had somehow brought back the best part of it, her son. Then Jason lost his job. At least that was what he said. The company had downsized. He explained. He just needed time to find something better. Brittany claimed her workplace had become toxic, and she refused to stay somewhere that did not value her mental health. Margaret understood hardship. She told them to take the guest room as long as they needed. A few weeks became a few months. Then Brittany said the apartment lease had ended and renewing would be financially irresponsible when Margaret had all this extra space. Jason assured her they would contribute once they got back on their feet. They never did. Instead, they settled in the way roots settle beneath concrete. Slowly, quietly, permanently. The guest room became their room. Their boxes spread into the garage. Their toiletries multiplied in the bathroom. Their streaming subscriptions appeared on the television, while their names never once appeared on a utility bill. At first Margaret made excuses for them. The economy was difficult. Employers were unfair. Young people had it harder these days. That was what everyone said. But then she noticed the packages. New clothes. Designer sneakers. Brittany's skincare deliveries stacked by the door every week. Jason bought a gaming chair that cost more than Margaret had spent on herself in 5 years. They always had money for takeout, subscriptions, concert tickets, and weekend trips with friends. Just never for groceries. Never for rent. Never for the electric bill. Margaret's retirement savings had begun thinning faster than she liked to admit. Then property taxes rose. Then her old sedan needed repairs. Then the furnace failed in January during the coldest week of the year. By spring, she had quietly taken the DoorDash job because there was no other way to keep everything afloat without admitting how bad things had become. She told Jason it was just to stay active. He had laughed and said, "Honestly, Mom, good for you. Most people your age just sit around all day." That memory returned to her now as she scrubbed dried cheese from Brittany's favorite ceramic plate. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind had gone still. She thought of every morning she had left before sunrise while they slept, every grocery run, every mortgage payment, every sacrifice she had disguised as love. And standing there in the kitchen with cold dishwater soaking her aching hands, Margaret realized something she should have admitted long ago. Jason and Brittany were not struggling. They were comfortable. Comfortable because she was struggling for them. The disrespect did not arrive in dramatic explosions. It came in dozens of smaller cuts. The kind easy to excuse one at a time until a person woke up bleeding from all of them. Margaret began noticing everything after that morning in the kitchen. As if someone had adjusted a lens she had worn too long. Jason no longer asked before borrowing her car. He simply took the keys from the hook by the door and returned the sedan with the gas tank near empty and fast food wrappers in the cup holders. Brittany stopped pretending to clean up after herself entirely. Makeup-stained towels piled on the bathroom floor. Half-drunk iced coffees sweated rings into Margaret's wooden end tables. Online packages arrived daily, stacked on the porch with Brittany's name in cheerful black print, while Margaret clipped grocery coupons at the kitchen table to keep the weekly bill under budget. Every room in the house carried evidence that Margaret paid for lives far more comfortable than her own. The electric bill climbed because neither of them ever turned anything off. The thermostat stayed at 74 in winter and 68 in summer, because Brittany said she was temperature sensitive. The grocery bill doubled because Jason had developed opinions about organic snacks and specialty protein drinks despite contributing nothing toward them. Even Margaret's small luxuries disappeared one by one. The vanilla creamer she bought once a month for her coffee vanished in 3 days. Her favorite imported crackers, a treat she allowed herself every Christmas, were gone before she opened the box. When she gently mentioned it one evening, Brittany laughed from the couch and said, "Well, if you buy good stuff, people are going to eat it." Jason smirked without looking up from his phone. The final straw came on a Thursday afternoon after a 12-hour shift delivering food across town in freezing rain. Margaret walked through the front door soaked to the knees, her hair damp around her face, her shoulders trembling from cold and fatigue. She had been looking forward all day to the container of chicken soup she had left in the refrigerator that morning, the last of a batch she had made herself over the weekend. It was gone. In its place sat the empty plastic container in the sink, unwashed. Brittany was sprawled on the couch scrolling through her phone beneath the blanket Margaret had knitted 15 years earlier. Jason was in the recliner playing video games. "Did one of you eat my soup?" Margaret asked quietly, setting down her keys. Brittany did not even glance up. "Oh, yeah, I was starving." Margaret stared at her. "That was my dinner." Brittany shrugged. "Well, there is cereal in the pantry." Jason laughed at the television screen, not because anything on it was funny, but because he had heard and did not care. Margaret stood there dripping rainwater onto her own floor while her stomach clenched with hunger and something colder than anger. Then Brittany added, in the same absent tone one might use discussing the weather, "Honestly, Margaret, if you are going to keep working all day, you should probably start meal prepping better." The room went silent except for the sound of gunfire from Jason's game. Margaret looked at her son then, really looked at him, waiting for embarrassment, for shame, for any flicker of decency. But Jason only reached for another handful of chips and said, "She has got a point, Mom." Something in Margaret's face must have changed then, because Brittany shifted slightly under the blanket, suddenly uncertain. Margaret did not yell. She did not cry. She simply nodded once, turned, and walked upstairs with the same calm expression she wore when balancing her checkbook. But behind that calm, a thought had begun to harden into certainty. Her son and his wife no longer saw her as family. They saw her as a utility, a roof, a refrigerator, a wallet with wrinkles. And for the first time, Margaret stopped wondering how to make them appreciate her, and began wondering how much longer she intended to tolerate them. The wake-up call came 2 days later in the freezing rain on the far east side of town, with Margaret standing beneath the flickering awning of a rundown apartment building trying to steady her breathing around a pain that had spread like fire across her chest. She had just climbed 3 flights of slick concrete stairs carrying 2 heavy bags of groceries because the customer had requested door delivery and contactless service, as if a woman her age should be grateful for the extra exercise. By the time she made it back to her car, her vision had blurred at the edges and her knees nearly buckled beneath her. She sat behind the steering wheel with both hands pressed against her ribs, waiting for the dizziness to pass. But it did not. A tapping on the driver's side window startled her. A man in his 40s wearing a construction jacket stood outside looking concerned. Margaret lowered the window an inch. "Mom, are you all right?" he asked. She forced a smile that felt brittle. "Just need a minute." He frowned. "You do not look fine." The words should not have mattered. They were ordinary words from a stranger. But something in his tone, gentle, matter-of-fact, entirely free of pity, made Margaret's throat tighten unexpectedly. She tried to laugh it off. "Long day." The man glanced at the insulated delivery bag on her passenger seat, then back at her silver hair and lined face. "You are out here doing deliveries in this weather?" Margaret nodded. Bills do not pay themselves. He hesitated before asking, "Do you not have family to help you?" The question struck harder than the pain in her chest. Margaret opened her mouth to answer and found she did not know what to say. She had family. They slept in her house, ate her food, used her electricity, borrowed her car. But help her? The truth sat in her throat like broken glass. She looked away toward the rain streaking down her windshield. "No," she said quietly. "Not really." The man nodded once, as if he understood more than she had said. "My mother is 69, he told her. If I found out she was working herself sick while I sat at home, she would have raised me wrong." He meant nothing cruel by it. His tone held no accusation. But Margaret felt those words settle deep in her chest, heavier than shame and sharper than pain. She thanked him, waited until her breathing steadied, and drove home in silence. The house was warm when she walked in, warmer than she kept it when she was alone because Brittany hated feeling chilly. The smell of cinnamon rolls drifted from the kitchen. For one foolish moment Margaret thought perhaps they had made her breakfast. Then she saw the 3 empty bakery boxes on the counter, and Brittany licking frosting from her thumb while Jason laughed at something on his phone. Neither looked up when Margaret entered. Her wet shoes squeaked against the tile. "You are home early," Brittany said absently. "Can you stop by the store later? We are out of almond milk." Margaret stood there in the doorway, rainwater dripping from her coat onto the floor they had never once mopped. She looked at the half-eaten pastries, the expensive coffee drinks on the counter, the 2 healthy adults in matching loungewear who had apparently spent the morning eating bakery breakfast while she nearly collapsed earning the money that paid for it. Something inside her went very still. "No," Margaret said. Brittany blinked, finally looking up. "What?" Margaret slowly removed her wet coat and hung it by the door. "No," she repeated calmly. "I will not be going to the store later." Jason laughed as though she had made a joke. "Okay, well, tomorrow then." Margaret met his eyes, and for the first time in years, he seemed to notice something unfamiliar there. Not sadness, not fatigue, not guilt waiting to be manipulated, just clarity. She gave a small nod to herself, more than to them, and walked upstairs without another word. In her bedroom, she sat on the edge of the mattress she had once shared with Harold and stared at the framed photograph on the nightstand, his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling in front of the lake on their 40th anniversary. "I let this go on too long," she whispered to the empty room. Then Margaret Whitmore reached for her phone, opened her contacts, and called the attorney who had handled Harold's estate. Margaret met with Harold's attorney the following afternoon in a quiet brick office downtown that still smelled faintly of leather and coffee, the same office where she and her husband had signed their wills nearly 15 years earlier. Thomas Riley looked older now, thinner through the face, but his handshake remained steady and his eyes sharpened the moment he heard the reason for her visit. Margaret did not dramatize. She simply laid out the facts the way one presents numbers at a bank. 2 unemployed adults living in her home for 3 years. No rent, no bills, no assistance. A 71-year-old widow driving food deliveries to support everyone under her roof. Thomas listened in silence, then removed his glasses and said, very carefully, "Margaret, you understand you do not owe your adult son indefinite support." She gave a humorless smile. "Apparently I am the last person in this family to learn that." For the next hour they reviewed everything. The deed remained solely in Margaret's name. Harold had left the house entirely to her. Jason had no claim. Thomas advised her to protect her accounts, revise her will immediately, and begin formal eviction proceedings if she wanted them out. Margaret signed every document with the calm precision of someone balancing a checkbook, though her hands trembled only once, when she crossed out Jason's equal inheritance share and redirected the majority of her estate to charity, with a smaller protected amount placed in trust for a future grandchild should one ever exist. I loved my son, she said quietly as she signed, but I will not finance his selfishness after I am gone. Thomas nodded as if he had heard some version of that sentence many times before. When Margaret returned home that evening, the house was empty except for music playing from upstairs. She moved quietly through the kitchen, setting down her purse, when Brittany's laughter floated down from the second-floor landing. Margaret paused. Brittany was on the phone, her voice bright and careless. "No, girl, I'm serious," she said between laughs. "We are basically set for life here. Jason says his mother would rather work herself into the grave than admit she needs help, so as long as we keep acting stressed, she folds every time." Margaret stood perfectly still. "Sure," Brittany continued. "Honestly, it is kind of genius. Free housing, free groceries, free utilities. She even fills the gas tank after we borrow the car. I told Jason we should stay until the house is ours eventually. Why rush?" Another laugh. Then, in a lower voice full of smug amusement, "She is not a person anymore. Honestly, she is a retirement plan with a pulse." Margaret did not move for several seconds. She had thought the worst part would be hearing disrespect. She had been wrong. The worst part was hearing her son in the background laugh at the joke. Not protest. Not defend her. Laugh. Something final settled inside Margaret then. Not like anger, but like a door closing. She walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and calmly wrote her name on every shelf item she had purchased with a black marker. Milk, eggs, yogurt, butter, leftovers. Then she went to the hall closet and removed the spare car keys Jason used whenever he pleased. Then she gathered every financial statement from the desk drawer and locked them in her bedroom safe. By the time Jason and Brittany came downstairs an hour later, Margaret was sitting in her usual armchair with a book open in her lap, glasses perched low on her nose, looking for all the world like the same quiet woman they had ignored for years. Brittany stopped short at the sight of the labeled groceries. "What is all this?" she asked with a nervous laugh. Margaret turned a page without looking up. "Inventory," she said simply. Jason frowned. "Mom, what is your problem lately?" Margaret looked at him then, calm as winter. "I do not have a problem, Jason," she replied. "I have clarity." Neither of them knew what that meant yet, but for the first time, both of them looked uneasy, and Margaret found that she liked the feeling very much. The transformation was subtle enough that Jason and Brittany mistook it for surrender. Margaret stopped reminding them about chores. She stopped commenting on the mess, stopped asking where they had been, stopped mentioning bills entirely. She moved through the house with such calm politeness that Brittany eventually rolled her eyes and whispered to Jason one afternoon, "See? She got over whatever weird phase that was." Margaret heard it from the hallway and nearly smiled. Let them think that, she thought. Let them believe comfort had returned. In truth, every quiet day was another brick in the wall she was building around herself. She canceled the secondary cards attached to her accounts and claimed the bank had flagged suspicious activity. She changed the passwords on every streaming service, every utility login, every account Jason had ever casually accessed under the excuse of helping her with technology. She transferred her savings into a protected trust on Thomas Riley's recommendation and opened a new checking account at a different bank entirely. She arranged for the title of her sedan to be updated with additional protections so no one could attempt to use or transfer it without her authorization. She even met with a locksmith, who quietly replaced every exterior lock one Tuesday morning while Jason and Brittany were out at brunch with friends, funded no doubt by money they insisted they did not have. When Brittany noticed the new locks, she frowned. Why did you change them? Margaret folded a dish towel with careful hands and answered without looking up. Because it is my house. Brittany stared, clearly uncertain whether she had heard correctly. Then she laughed awkwardly and walked away. The following Friday, Margaret overheard something that confirmed just how blind their confidence had made them. Jason and Brittany sat at the kitchen table late that evening, thinking she had gone to bed. Margaret paused halfway up the stairs when she heard her own name. We need to push her on the refinance thing again. Brittany whispered. If she adds you to the house now, it will make everything easier later. Jason sighed. She keeps dodging it. Then tell her it is for tax planning or estate stuff. She does not understand any of that anyway. A pause. Then Brittany added, honestly, if she would just retire already and stay home, we could save a fortune when we have kids. Free childcare, free housing, inheritance coming eventually. We are literally one paperwork signature away from being set. Jason laughed softly. You always think 5 moves ahead. Margaret stood frozen on the stairs in the dark, one hand gripping the banister so tightly her knuckles whitened. They were not simply using her. They were planning her future for her as if she were already halfway gone. Not a mother. Not a woman. A resource to be managed until death made them rich. Margaret climbed the rest of the stairs without a sound and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time in the dark. The same dark she had once shared with Harold after hard days when life still made sense. Then she opened her nightstand drawer and removed the envelope Thomas had prepared for her that afternoon. Inside were formal eviction notices. 30 days. Legally binding. Properly filed. She ran her fingertips over the paper and felt no hesitation, only peace. The next morning, she made pancakes from scratch and served breakfast with such warmth that Jason actually smiled and kissed her cheek before eating. Brittany complimented the syrup. Margaret poured coffee for everyone and sat at the table in her robe, looking every bit the gentle widow they believed they had broken into obedience. Across from her, Jason talked casually about maybe taking a weekend trip to Nashville if they could borrow her car again. Margaret stirred cream into her coffee and listened with serene patience, thinking not of what they were saying, but of how their faces would look when the fantasy they had built collapsed beneath them. She took a slow sip, set down the cup, and smiled into the steam. Margaret chose Sunday evening for the first crack in their illusion because Sunday had become their favorite day to behave like a family, while contributing nothing to one. Jason lounged in the recliner watching football. Brittany sat cross-legged on the sofa scrolling through furniture listings she had no business browsing. The smell of pot roast lingered in the air from the dinner Margaret had cooked herself, because old habits died slower than resentment. She waited until the plates were cleared and the television volume lowered before stepping into the living room with a manila folder in her hands. I need to discuss something important, she said. Jason barely glanced up. Can it wait until halftime? No, Margaret replied. Something in her tone made him mute the television. Brittany straightened slightly. Margaret remained standing rather than taking her usual chair. Beginning next month, she said calmly. This household will operate differently. Jason frowned. What does that mean? Margaret opened the folder and withdrew 3 sheets of paper. It means if you intend to continue living here for the next 30 days, you will each pay rent, utilities, and your share of groceries. I have outlined the amounts. She handed the pages over. Jason stared at them as if she had given him medical test results. Brittany actually laughed. Wait, you are serious? Completely. Jason scanned the page and his face reddened. This is over $2,000 a month. Correct, Margaret said. That is less than market value for comparable housing in this area. Brittany tossed the paper onto the coffee table. We cannot afford that. Margaret met her gaze. Then you cannot afford to live here. Silence dropped over the room so suddenly even the refrigerator hum from the kitchen seemed loud. Jason blinked at her, stunned. "Mom, where is this coming from?" Margaret folded her hands loosely in front of her. "From 3 years of paying every bill in this house while 2 healthy adults live here for free." Brittany's voice sharpened instantly. "Oh my God. Are you seriously doing this now? After everything we have been through?" Margaret raised one eyebrow. "Everything you have been through?" Brittany stood. "We supported you after your husband died." Margaret let that sentence hang in the air for a beat. Then she answered, very softly, "You moved in 1 month after the funeral and never left." Jason stood too now, his expression hardening into the entitled outrage of a man unaccustomed to consequences. "This is insane. We are family." Margaret nodded once. "Exactly. Family should not exploit one another." "Nobody is exploiting you," Jason snapped. "We help around here." Margaret looked at him with a calm so cold it made Brittany shift backward. "Name 1 bill you pay." Jason opened his mouth, closed it. Brittany crossed her arms. "This is because of your little attitude lately. Somebody got in your head." Margaret almost smiled at that. "No, Brittany. What got into my head was clarity." She placed a second envelope on the coffee table beside the rent breakdown. "If you choose not to pay, then you may consider that your formal 30-day notice to vacate." Brittany's mouth fell open. Jason stared at the envelope, then at his mother, as though he were seeing a stranger wearing her face. "You cannot be serious," he whispered. Margaret's expression did not move. "I have never been more serious in my life." Jason's voice rose. "You would throw your own son out?" "No," Margaret replied. "I am asking my adult son to stand on his own feet." Brittany let out a bitter laugh. "You are going to regret this." Margaret turned toward her slowly. "No," she said. "Regret was working myself sick while you mocked me in my own house. This is simply correction." Neither of them spoke. They only stared as Margaret gathered the empty dinner plates from the side table with the same composed dignity she had always carried, except now it no longer looked like softness. It looked like strength. And for the first time since moving in, Jason and Brittany understood something they should have realized years earlier. Margaret Whitmore had not become weak with age. She had simply run out of patience. The next 30 days turned the house into a battlefield fought entirely through silence, slammed cabinets, and carefully chosen cruelty. Jason and Brittany did not pay a cent. Instead, they launched a campaign of wounded outrage, moving through the house as if Margaret had betrayed them rather than the reverse. Brittany cried loudly on the phone to friends within earshot about how heartless it was to abandon family during hard times. Jason muttered under his breath whenever Margaret entered a room, making sure words like selfish and senile floated just loud enough to be heard. They expected guilt to soften her. It did not. Margaret remained maddeningly calm. She continued working her delivery shifts, but now with a strange lightness in her chest, as if every mile driven carried her closer to freedom. She bought groceries only for herself and kept them in a locked mini refrigerator in her bedroom. She stopped washing dishes she had not used. She stopped replacing toiletries once they ran out. When Jason asked where the laundry detergent had gone, Margaret looked up from her crossword puzzle and said, "Adults usually purchase their own." The humiliation on his face was almost worth the years she had lost. By the second week, panic had replaced outrage. Brittany tried a softer strategy first, appearing in the kitchen one morning with watery eyes and a trembling voice. "Margaret, I think we got off on the wrong foot. We have all just been stressed. Surely we can work something out." Margaret folded her newspaper and regarded her with mild interest. "We can. It is called rent. Due on the 1st. Brittany's expression hardened instantly. The sweetness vanished like stage makeup under rain. "You are unbelievable." "So I have been told," Margaret replied, and returned to reading. Jason tried anger next. 3 nights before the deadline, he cornered her in the garage while she unloaded groceries from her car. "You are humiliating me." He snapped. I am your son. Margaret set a bag on the hood and faced him squarely. Then perhaps you should have behaved like one. His jaw clenched. You are choosing pride over family. Margaret shook her head slowly. No, Jason. I am choosing self-respect over exploitation. He stared at her with a look she had never seen before, not guilt, not shame, but resentment that his source of comfort had developed boundaries. On the 30th morning, Brittany emerged from upstairs in leggings and an expensive coat, still somehow dressed better than a woman with nowhere to go. We need more time, she announced. Margaret sipped her coffee at the kitchen table. No. Jason threw up his hands. We have been looking. Margaret slid a printed screenshot across the table without a word. It showed Brittany's social media post from 2 nights earlier. Cocktails at a rooftop bar. Caption living our best life. Jason's face drained of color. If you had money for rooftop drinks, Margaret said calmly, you had money for a deposit somewhere else. No one spoke after that. By noon, a rented moving truck sat in the driveway. The neighbors pretended not to stare, but all of them did. Margaret watched from the front porch in her cardigan as Jason and Brittany hauled boxes to the truck with furious, jerking movements, neither willing to meet her eyes. Brittany slammed the passenger door before muttering, "Enjoy dying alone in this house." Margaret smiled with the gentleness of a woman discussing weather. Better alone than used. Jason lingered one moment longer by the truck, anger and disbelief battling across his face. I cannot believe you did this to us, he said. Margaret stepped down from the porch until she stood eye to eye with the son she no longer recognized. No, Jason, she said quietly. You did this to yourselves when you mistook my love for weakness. Then she turned, walked back inside, and shut the front door before either of them could answer. For the first time in 3 years, the silence that followed was not lonely. It was peace. The first morning after Jason and Brittany left, Margaret woke at 6 out of habit and lay still in the quiet, waiting for the usual dread to settle over her. It never came. No television blaring downstairs. No slammed cabinet doors. No footsteps overhead from people who treated her home like a hotel. Only silence, clean, uninterrupted, sacred silence. She sat up slowly in bed and listened to it with tears stinging unexpectedly behind her eyes. Then she laughed. A soft, breathless laugh that sounded rusty from disuse. That morning she walked barefoot through every room in the house, touching furniture she had not truly seen in years beneath the clutter and carelessness of other people's mess. She opened windows despite the chill just to let fresh air move through the rooms. She washed the sheets in the guest room and donated half the abandoned junk Jason and Brittany had left behind before sunset. For the first time in years, her house smelled like lemon polish instead of takeout and entitlement. She quit DoorDash the following week. Not dramatically, not with fanfare. She simply turned off the app after her final shift, set the insulated red bag in the back of the hall closet, and never opened it again. Without 2 extra adults draining every dollar she earned, Margaret discovered her pension and savings were more than enough for a quiet life. She had never been poor. She had merely been financing other people's comfort. The realization stung, but not as much as the freedom soothed. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came a version of Margaret Whitmore her neighbors had not seen in years. She planted tulips along the front walkway. She joined a Wednesday morning book club at the library. She had brunch with women her age who laughed loudly and ordered mimosas without apology. She took a weekend trip to Vermont with her church group and bought herself a wool coat she would once have called too expensive. Every now and then Jason texted. At first the messages were furious, then accusatory, then pleading. Brittany never contacted her directly, though Margaret heard through mutual acquaintances that the marriage had grown tense once real bills entered the picture. She did not respond to either of them beyond a single sentence sent after Jason's 4th voicemail in 1 week. I will always love you, but I will never again subsidize your disrespect. After that, the messages slowed, then stopped. One warm June evening, Margaret sat alone on her back porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in lavender and gold over the fence Harold had built with his own hands. The garden glowed with late spring blooms. Wind chimes stirred softly overhead. Her house, her home, stood quiet behind her, peaceful in a way it had not been since before the funeral. Margaret leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, letting the evening breeze brush against her face. She thought of the woman who had once dragged aching bones through freezing mornings to feed two ungrateful adults because she believed love meant endless sacrifice. That woman had not been weak. She had simply forgotten that kindness without boundaries becomes permission. Margaret opened her eyes and smiled into the fading light. Somewhere in town, her son was learning the lesson she should have taught him years earlier. Adulthood was not something your mother funded for you. It was something you earned. And for the first time in a very long time, Margaret Whitmore slept deeply in a house that belonged only to her, under a roof no one else was living beneath at her expense, with peace in her heart and the windows cracked open to the summer air.